You've been given the title, the position. The org chart finally says your name at the top. And still, nobody follows you. They show up. They nod in meetings. They do the minimum required not to get fired. But the moment you leave the room, the real conversation starts. The one without you in it. Here's what almost nobody tells you about leadership. Authority and followership are not the same thing. You can own the first and never earn the second. And the gap between them is exactly where most leaders quietly fail, year after year, never understanding why their best people keep leaving for someone who has a smaller title and a bigger following. 800 years ago, a king understood this distinction better than almost anyone who ever wore a crown. Men followed him into a foreign desert, thousands of miles from home, with no promise of return, no real chance of payment, and an enemy commander who was, by every account, smarter than he was. They followed him anyway. His name was Richard, King of England. History remembers him as the Lionheart. Today I'm going to walk you through exactly what made men follow him into impossible odds. Not the myth, the mechanism. 5 chapters. Each one is a leadership principle disguised as a war story. Stay until the end, because the last one, what happened at the gates of Jerusalem, when he was close enough to take the city and chose not to look at it, will change how you think about the difference between winning and leading. Chapter 1. The man who leads from the front line. Most people who get promoted into leadership do something predictable. They retreat. They move their desk further from the floor. They start receiving information instead of gathering it. They begin managing the report about the problem instead of the problem itself. Richard did the opposite, and it should have killed him several times over. At the Siege of Acre in 1191, after 2 grinding years of siege warfare that had exhausted 3 armies, Richard arrived sick, feverish, barely able to stand. And instead of directing from a tent, he had himself carried to the front lines on a stretcher so he could personally oversee the bombardment. He ordered the construction of siege engines with names like Bad Neighbor and God's Own Catapult, and he stood close enough to their operation to adjust range and timing himself. This is not recklessness. This is information theory. A leader who only receives filtered reports is making decisions on yesterday's truth. A leader standing on the wall is making decisions on right now. His men didn't just see a king. They saw a king choosing to share their risk when nothing forced him to. That single fact rewires a soldier's brain. Authority says, obey me. Shared risk says, trust me. Only one of those creates someone who will walk into fire beside you. The lesson is not expose yourself to physical danger. The lesson is sharper than that. Find out, personally, regularly, what the front line of your responsibility actually feels like. Not the summary of it, the texture of it. Leaders lose followers the moment their decisions stop matching the reality their people are living in. Chapter 2. Why fear-based command collapses under pressure. There is a kind of leader who gets compliance through fear. It works for a while. It looks like leadership from a distance. Up close, it's something else entirely. A system that only functions as long as the leader is watching. The moment Richard's army faced its hardest test wasn't a siege. It was the long, brutal march from Acre to Jaffa in the punishing heat of late summer 1191, harassed daily by Saladin's fast-moving cavalry and archers, men collapsing from heat stroke and exhaustion, morale cracking. This is exactly the condition under which fear-led armies disintegrate. Men who only obey out of fear find 1,000 quiet ways to stop trying the second the pressure rises. They slow down, they hide, they let the man next to them take the risk instead. Richard's army held formation. Historians point to the same explanation again and again. Discipline that had been earned through trust, not extracted through threat. At Arsuf, when the moment came to break formation and counterattack, his knights moved together decisively on his signal, not because they feared the consequence of hesitating, but because they had absorbed his judgment as their own through months of shared hardship. Fear-based authority needs constant enforcement. Trust-based authority runs on inertia. It keeps working even when no one is checking. Ask yourself honestly, if you left the room for a month, would the standard hold? If the answer is no, what you've built isn't leadership, it's supervision. Chapter 3. The discipline of patience inside chaos. Here is something almost no one expects from a man nicknamed for his heart and his ferocity. His greatest strength was restraint. After the victory at Arsuf, Saladin made a calculated decision to destroy the fortress town of Ascalon, rather than let Richard capture and use it. Nearly every voice around Richard wanted to push immediately toward Jerusalem, the prize, the symbol, the thing the entire crusade was supposedly for. Richard, instead, insisted on the unglamorous work first, rebuilding Ascalon, securing the supply line, making sure that any future advance wouldn't collapse from logistics rather than combat. It was not the popular decision. It was the correct one. This is the part of leadership nobody puts on a recruiting poster. The instinct of an untested leader, when surrounded by pressure and noise, is to act, to produce visible motion so it looks like progress. The instinct of a tested leader is to ask what the army actually needs before it needs glory. There's a pattern worth naming here because it shows up in every domain, not just war. Urgency and importance are not the same thing, and the leaders people will follow anywhere are the ones who can tell the difference under pressure when everyone around them is shouting for the urgent thing instead of the important one. Richard's men trusted his patience precisely because his impulsiveness was already legendary. They had seen him charge. When he chose, instead, to wait, they understood it wasn't fear. It was judgment. And judgment, demonstrated under pressure, is worth more to a follower than 100 speeches about vision. Chapter 4. Respecting the enemy without losing the men. One of the strangest, most instructive threads of this entire war is the relationship between Richard and the man he was fighting, Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria. These two men never met face to face during the entire war. And yet chroniclers from both sides describe an exchange of gifts, of courtesies, of something close to mutual respect, passed through messengers and translators. When Richard fell seriously ill in 1192, Saladin sent fresh fruit and his own personal physician to the camp of the man trying to take Jerusalem from him. A weaker leader would see this as a contradiction. How can you respect the man you're trying to defeat? But Richard's men did not read it as softness. They read it as confidence. A leader who needs to dehumanize the opponent to keep his own men motivated is signaling quietly that his position isn't strong enough to survive a clear-eyed view of the situation. Richard's troops didn't need him to lie to them about who they were fighting. They needed him to be honest about the stakes and still lead them into it. This is a principle that outlives the Crusades entirely. The leaders people follow longest are not the ones who simplify the world into easy villains. They're the ones who can hold complexity, tell their people the truth about how hard a thing is, and still walk toward it first. Fear of an enemy you respect is sustainable. Fear of an enemy you've been lied about collapses the first time your people see the truth for themselves. Chapter 5. The moment he chose not to look. In June 1192, Richard's forces came within a few miles of Jerusalem. Twice, close enough that scouts could see the walls. Close enough that many of his own men begged him to finish what the entire crusade had been built around. Richard refused to look at the city. There are different accounts of exactly why. Supply lines stretched too thin, his coalition fracturing, Philip of France long gone home, the realistic odds of holding Jerusalem, even if he took it dropping with every week that passed. But the detail that survived in legend is this: he would not let himself see Jerusalem unless he could take it and keep it. He understood that a symbolic victory followed by an inevitable loss would have been worse for the men who trusted him than no victory at all. This is the hardest thing leadership ever asks of anyone, and it's the chapter most leaders fail. It is far easier to chase the visible win, the thing that looks like success in the moment, that gets the applause, that lets you tell people you accomplished something, than to make the harder call that protects the people who are depending on you, even when that call disappoints everyone, even when history might remember it as falling short. Richard went home without Jerusalem. He was captured and ransomed on the journey back, betrayed by exactly the kind of political resentment his own bluntness had created along the way. By the narrow metric of the stated goal, the Third Crusade did not succeed. And yet the men who served under him did not remember a failure. The chroniclers who fought beside him, the soldiers who survived Acre and Arsuf, and the march through the heat, wrote of a king who never asked them to bear a risk he wasn't already standing inside. That is the formula underneath all 5 chapters. Lead from where the consequences actually land. Build trust that doesn't need a threat to keep functioning. Tell the difference between the urgent and the important, especially when the room is loud. Respect what you're up against instead of lying about it to feel stronger. And when the visible win and the responsible choice split apart, have the discipline to choose the one that protects your people, even if no one applauds it that day. A title makes people report to you. Only this makes them follow you. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone who's leading right now and could use the reminder. Subscribe. This channel exists for people who want to understand power and character without the noise. Until next time, share